Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special installment of the Commonwealth Speaker Series, co-hosted by UBI Works. My name is Ken Yang, and today I'm speaking with two of the most interesting and forward-looking futurists I've met, David Shapiro and Dalibor Petrovic, to talk about something that to some seem like science fiction, but I believe is actually quickly entering the realm of reality and mainstream consciousness. And that is the topic of post-labor economics and the role of universal basic income. Thanks for joining us, guys.
Thanks for
It's a
having me.
pleasure.
Those of you who've been following UBI Works know that we've been very interested in the topic of AI, job automation, and the polarization of our economy in terms of income, wealth, and opportunity. And also, how can we steward the technology to create a future of abundance that actually benefits humanity and unlocks human flourishing? There are a lot of questions about what the world's going to look like in a few years, in a few decades, when the cost of human labor and intelligence trends towards zero and may no longer be necessary for much of the work we do today. How will we spend our time? How will we put food on the table? Where do we find purpose beyond paid employment? And in all of this, where does UBI and other models of building Commonwealth fit in? Now, just to give people a little bit of an intro to both of you, David, you've built an incredibly interesting project on post-labor economics. You have a fast-growing YouTube channel coming up on almost 200,000 subscribers, a highly engaged Substack. You bring decades of experience in AI and machine learning, and you have a book on the way. And I believe you have taken this conversation to a level that, frankly, I haven't seen anybody else do, which is really why I want to bring more people's attention to what you do. And Dalibor, you come at this with a wealth of experience in business management. You're the founder of the Summit Leadership Alliance, former senior partner at Deloitte, and a member of the Harvard Business Review Advisory Council. And recently, you began working with David to create a master series on post-labor economics. So I'd love to hear from both of you about what it is exactly post-labor economics and why should people be thinking about this? David, let's start with you.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here and great introduction. So post-labor economics, in a nutshell, is the reaction to the decline of labor. So we've had a structural secular trend, decline of labor since starting in about the 90s. Now, some people mistake this and say, oh, we're heading for post-scarcity or, fully automated luxury space communism or something like that. But this is not a complete reimagining or overhaul of economics. It is strictly the observation that household income is under threat. This is not necessarily an edge case. This is a consensus view amongst some concerned economists that if wages go down because labor goes down, then household income goes down. And that's a linchpin of the economy, meaning aggregate demand, tax base, all that sort of thing is dependent upon household income. So then the question is, in a post-labor world, then how does the economy continue to work? And that is the kind of 30,000 foot view of what is post-labor economics. Now, in terms of what it recommends, because that's understanding the problem, which is phase one. And then phase two is, what do you actually do about it? And what you do about it is you pivot to other ways of shoring up household income, such as universal basic income. I think that is definitely an ingredient that we'll unpack throughout this talk. But there's other things that you can do, such as sovereign wealth funds. You can do trusts. You can do negative income taxes. There's hundreds of little tips and tricks out there throughout the world that I've found in my research that can allow you to restructure the economy so that you channel assets and wealth to households. Now, quick preview, household income is broken down into three buckets, and that is wage-based income, capital-based income, and government transfers. And a government transfer is basically some form of welfare, whether it is retirement or Social Security. Those sorts of things are examples of government transfers. The stimulus checks that we had during the pandemic was another example of a transfer. Right now, for most developed nations, the ratio is around 60%. In aggregate, 60% of household income comes from wages. Another 20% comes from government transfers, and another 20% comes from capital-based income. And capital in this case is stocks, bonds, businesses, rental properties, that sort of thing. Now it's very lopsided because the poorer, the lower income households, they get more of the government transfers, and the wealthier households get more of the capital-based income. And here's the final linchpin, the kind of pinch point is in this future, so we have these three buckets that we're drawing from. So if wages go down, that means that you need to compensate with either capital or transfers. That's by process of elimination. Those are the two options. Now, certainly, I do believe that something like UBI is a necessary but not sufficient ingredient to replace lost wages. So by process of elimination, we must find ways to increase capital-based income for households to keep the economy churning, which, aggregate demand, tax base for the government, and so on and so forth. That is the high level of post-labor economics.
There's a lot to unpack there, which we will do. But first, I'm going to ask Dalibor, as a seasoned business executive, what does this mean to you? In your mind, how do these ideas interact with the day-to-day realities of business owners and their employees today? Because what David described is a entirely new paradigm of thinking about economics, about value creation, about the nature of work. How do you see this, Dalibor?
Yeah, I think that we actually are in a massive tectonic shift in the society, in the economy, driven by this rapid and radical automation that is hitting us. And I have, for a number of years now, I've spent about 30 years in tech, last 20 of those 30 with Deloitte in a pretty senior role that is intended to help technology leaders, our clients, succeed. So I had a front seat view of the evolution of technology. This wave of automation that was literally became public 3 years ago with the ChatGPT release, it actually feels different. And the more I thought about this, the more I saw the uptake, the more I saw the capability, the more I realized that this actually is very, very new environment, and that we are heading towards a very rapid and drastic change. And that actually started to concern me. But it was me coming across David's work that literally put the right language to describe my concern. And that provided clarity. This is how we started collaborating. I believe that, I have been in business for many years. I believe this is the most radical transformation that is going to unfold. It will be impacting every industry, every organization. It is, of course, impacting human life, both privately and professionally. And it is because of that level of impact that I foresee that I believe we need to start having these conversations at all three levels through which this transition will play out. The level of policymakers at the very top, so governments at all levels, local, provincial or state and national and even subnational. And this is where the interventions will need to be considered and play out, including interventions such as universal basic income and others. That's a top layer that David has very well articulated in his manuscript called The Great Decoupling, the book that we hope will be published very soon. The middle layer of the model, which actually looks at organizations and what do organizations and enterprises really need to do to prepare, and not just for prepare for the transition, but to actually be inside that transition themselves and successfully and maximally automate themselves, but ethically, with clear consideration of what are the moral and ethical obligations towards the people that are impacted. And then at the bottom, the third component is the actual individuals like you and I and our families. What are we to do in order to prepare ourselves for this transition? So as a business leader myself, who's been at the forefront of technology, I clearly saw this time it's different. This is going to create a very, very significant change in our system across the economy, society, politics, individual family dynamics. And for that, I think we need a model. David has a model. David and I are working together to further refine and expand the model. And our intent is to broadcast this message loudly so that policymakers can hear this additional point of view, so that industry champions can similarly hear this point of view, understand what is their responsibility in the context of this post-labor transformation, and what are the people to do individually. And we believe that this actually creates a comprehensive model that could work. What I really liked about it, and I have to be very candid and honest about this, there are variants of, futurists talking about the age of abundance, the post-scarcity moment. These are all very true and inspiring descriptions. And I am actually a techno-optimist. I believe that at the end of this road, we are in for a treat. We are in for a true delight. We are in for a liberation of humanity, but the transition is the challenge. And this post-labor economics, I think, calls it out for what it truly is. We are moving into an economic model where human labor is not going to really be relevant, economically relevant anymore. So how do we navigate through that?
I think it's so prescient and also so validating that somebody in your stature is shining a light on this, both you and David. And I have to say that both of you are two of the greatest communicators that I have met, because these ideas it's very easy to make it seem very alienating, but you found a way to communicate this in a way that is very easy to understand and relatable, especially at this point in time. And our work at UBI Works and Commonwealth Canada over the last several years has been building these narratives to bridge to policymakers, to general audiences, members of the media, economists, members of the business community, to talk about these tectonic and systematic shifts in labor, in how wealth is created and managed in our economy. And so I just want to unpack this a little bit. David, when people think about economics, usually labor is a factor. There's labor, there's capital, there's technology, and of course, don't forget about land. So is it really possible to have a discipline of economics without the capital L?
Yeah. So when we talk about, if we go all the way back to elementary school economics, it comes down to two dichotomies, and that is supply and demand and sorry, I had a brain fart. Supply and demand, goods and services. There we go. So supply and demand of goods and services. Labor is not an intrinsic component of either of those. It is not a prerequisite. There are plenty of goods and services that we can already furnish that don't really require much labor input. Now, of course, the other dichotomy is labor and capital. So up until now, labor and capital have always been ingredients into the production of those goods and services. So when we take that and say, okay, well, what really is labor? Some purists will say, well, actually, labor is only what humans do, which you could abstract that further to it is something where you transform value, right? Or you create value. But with the rise of technology, we are already pivoting towards a trend of capital intensification and capital deepening. So capital intensification means that capital becomes more and more important to economic activity at the expense of labor. And we've seen this for several decades now, where automation has already encroached upon the need for human labor. Artificial intelligence, robotics, quantum computing, whatever else comes down the pipeline, these are just the next step in terms of that which can be automated. So if you take these trends to maximum conclusion, then within a few decades, the need for human labor will be basically zero. And this, of course, is not assuming that AI continues to accelerate and that robotics continues to accelerate. So when you say, okay, well, the economy is based on the supply and demand of goods and services, what if you can render all of those goods and services with next to no human inputs? And of course, some people say, oh, well, that's science fiction. That's complete fantasy. That's never going to happen. But then you say, well, where's the intrinsic law of economics or the law of physics that human hands and human brains must be a component of rendering those goods and services? We haven't had an opportunity to produce those goods and services without humans in the past, except for extraction, of course, where you just go pick up something that the earth has produced. But That's not to say that AI is going to be an ambient ecosystem. There's still going to be capital owners. But one way to frame this is that we're looking at what Dalibor sometimes calls capitalism 2.0. And this is where you have maximum capital deepening and capital intensification, to where, I and others call it hyper-capitalism, where capital is the only thing that matters, because the capital is what then produces goods and services. And in this case, capital is stuff that you own that is valuable. Data centers, robots, factories, those sorts of things. If the factories run themselves and are built by robots, and it's all powered by data centers and solar farms and fusion reactors, where's the human? You might have a human security guard to shut it off, but you're not going to run an entire economy if you have only 1% of the people in the future employed that are employed today. And of course, we can argue over how fast and how much, but the trend is almost inarguable, particularly when you look at the data. Hope that answers your question thoroughly enough.
Mm-hmm. And there's this traditional idea that wealth is created or value is created when a human labor is applied on capital equipment or machinery, or when humans are working the land. But that there's no rule that says that has to be the case, especially when we're seeing more of this, as you say, capital intensification. And I've heard the saying that capital is actually, you can see it as distilled labor. So is there perhaps no limit to how much you can distill or displace or replicate what labor used to do?
Yeah.
Dalibor. Yeah, David.
Go ahead.
I was going to ask you, Dalibor. He mentioned capitalism 2.0. What is that?
I think that it is really important to appreciate that it was the open market, free market economy that resulted in the greatest human societal success so far. Undoubtedly, we are living that. And Capitalism 2.0 is the next logical evolution of free market economy that is coming at us. And without intervention, without any interventions, we are risking that the story unfolds in a very unfavorable scenario for majority of humans, where just playing the movie forward, ultimately at the end of the day, all of the capital may concentrate at the owners of AI systems and automated robotic systems. And that will be a dystopian future. And so to me, what we need to do is we need to figure out a balance to preserve the free market economy, to preserve the economy in its free market flowing model, while at the same time figuring out a way to capture the newly created wealth that automation is going to undoubtedly bring, and figure out how do we ensure that humans across the society participate in enjoying that wealth that is now created without their direct labor. To me, figuring that balance out is what I call capitalism 2.0. Now, why both of these are important? If we preserve free market economy, we are preserving competition. This is really important part. If we are preserving competition, then competitive forces are going to drive the prices of goods and services that are now created through automation down and down and down. And ultimately, you can play that movie forward and say, look, in that circumstance, if we keep the competition going, the prices are going to actually drop very, very significantly at a point where everything is manufactured fully automatically. We need that because we need to have a lever that is going to actually act on technology being a deflationary force. So we need a mechanism to allow technology to be the deflationary force. And that can only really be achieved effectively through an open market, capitalistic, open market competitive system. But then at the same time, we need to figure out a way as a society to preserve the economy flow. Now, if you play the movie forward, as we automate more and more, we are detaching productivity from labor, right? We are detaching productivity from labor. This is why the basic premise that David starts with is saying, like, post-labor economics is essentially a realization that our GDP is being decoupled from people's performance in labor, right? So imagine this, what's happening, what will be happening is the more we automate, the productivity will be increasing, profitability will be increasing, right? Well, this is actually the process of concentration of that capital. New wealth will be generated, and new wealth will be generating at a fraction of the cost of the previous creation of that same wealth. So there is new wealth being created. The question now becomes, if we play that movie forward, we end up in a circumstance where most of the people are no longer economically viable as contributors to that economy. They cannot really, there's no competition anymore that humans can win against machines. The business case is, as I would say, grotesque. We need to figure out a way to keep families whole, right? And to me, that balance really is what we need to figure out. And to achieve that balance, we need policy interventions. We need enterprises to think about it ahead. And we need people, individuals, to reflect and perhaps take greater control over their individual financial sources, security, projections, plans, tactics, and so on.
I think you touched on something that's very central to this, which is that there will be increasing returns to those who own the capital and reducing share of income to labor, which has traditionally been most people's way of making an income and livelihood. And I often think about the equation R greater than G, which was what Thomas Piketty factored into his analysis in 21st Capital in 21st Century, which is as long as the returns to capital exceed the rate of growth of the economy, we're going to see increasing inequality around the world. And this seems almost to be a natural trajectory of our economy. And there's almost no signal that this trend may reverse without some really, really heavy-handed centralized planning approach. And this has been an aspect of the work we do at UBI Works in educating people and telling our policymakers that, look, this is not some anomaly of our economy. This is exactly where we're headed, naturally speaking, because this is kind of like the Matthew's principle, which is he who has more will be given more, and we're going to see, and he will have abundance, and he who has less, even what he has may be taken away from him.
So to me, Ken, I think that what you're saying is correct. Is correct. The question becomes, how do we explain this phenomena that David has identified and articulated? How do we explain it in the simplest possible set of terms and provide a big picture solution, again, in a simple set of words? So, David, if I might ask you, because this is yours, this is a Shapism. You're going to now hear a couple of Shapisms here. Can you, David, just very briefly introduce the concept of bigger, better, faster, cheaper, safer, and the concept of dexterity, just very quickly to set this up? Because we're also trying to figure out how do we explain this to policymakers,
right?
Very quickly.
Yeah. So technology, in the broad arc of history, technology, the reason that we do it is because it allows us to achieve the same outcomes better, faster, cheaper, and safer. Take, for instance, the steam engine. It adds a lot of strength, and so therefore it allows you to do a lot more. And it completely rewired the economy. Fast forward to electricity, the internet, and so on and so forth. Each of these technologies allows us to do things in a fundamentally different way. And it has not only reshaped the entire economy, it has reshaped society. So, for instance, in the before times, most of us would have been farmers. We had a very rural, rustic lifestyle. Because of industrialization, because of technology, we moved to the urban. And that has not happened in anyone living's lifetime. So therefore, our normalcy bias says this is the way things are, and this is how it's always been, and this is how it always will be. But the moment that technology becomes better, faster, cheaper, and safer than humans, it becomes economically irrational to have humans do that thing. And we've seen this happen time and time again, whether it was, farmhands that were replaced by plows and tractors and combines and everything else, whether it was seamstresses that were replaced by sewing machines, which have now even been more automated, filing clerks that have been replaced by Oracle databases. We've seen this time and time again. Now, the assumption has been that as machines are better, faster, cheaper, safer, that just liberates humans to do more work that's elsewhere. And it creates new job categories and so on and so forth, which has been true up to this point, except to the second framework is when you say, okay, well, what is it that humans offer the economy that is economically valuable? If you break it down into the 4 food groups of what it is that humans actually have that we can sell, it's strength, dexterity, cognition, and empathy. Everything that we do, every job flows from those 4 categories. I don't care whether it is a basketball player, software developer, venture capitalist. Literally all jobs are a combination of those 4 fundamental ingredients. Now, human strength is already mostly irrelevant. We've replaced our need for strength with diesel engines, electric motors, and so on and so forth. And of course, humanoid robots are coming up soon, and they're going to be even stronger and more dexterous. They're already more agile than humans. They can do cartwheels better than I can, certainly, and better than many non-trained gymnasts, and they're only continuing to improve. So strength, no longer a moat for human labor. Dexterity, not long for this world. Humanoid robots are already getting to the point where they have 0.1 millimeter precision, which is finer precision than the best neurosurgeons in the world.
Mm-hmm.
It's only improving from here. So strength, not a moat. Dexterity, not a moat for much longer. Cognition, as we're already seeing with artificial intelligence in the form of ChatGPT, large language models, transformers, all the various forms of AI that are coming out, they already surpass pretty much all humans in most economically valuable intellectual tasks. Science, math, law, medicine, all of those. Humans are already inferior. And certainly no one human is better than them. But also, not only are these machines already better, they're faster because they think almost instantly and they're available 24/7. They're cheaper than humans too. ChatGPT subscription costs $20 a month, and it is your universal PhD in your pocket. And in some respects, it's also safer because it's an instant second opinion. So cognition is not a moat, and that leaves empathy. And from empathy, you get things like authenticity and experiences and meaning, which could be the final moat for humanity. Just because humans are neurologically, biologically wired, we evolved to prefer to interact with other humans in many circumstances. But you say, okay, well, is that one moat enough to carry the entire economy? And all of the data says no. and here's an example. Let me give you one example, and then I'll pass the ball back. So as a YouTuber, I capture about 50,000 hours per month of human attention, and that translates to about $2,000. That does not multiply. That doesn't add up. Yep. If you cannot have every single person capturing 50,000 hours of human attention every single month. And this is what we've seen in the attention economy or the experience economy or the meaning economy, is that it's the top decile and often the top 1% take most of the rewards. So it's winners take most or winner takes all, meaning that's not a sustainable model for the rest of the economy. So the natural conclusion is, as machines become better, faster, cheaper, safer than most of humans, then sure, there's going to be a few comedians and basketball players and musicians left. Taylor Swift is going to be fine, but I probably won't because I'm not that smart compared to the AI. But before long, people are going to be like, whatever, Dave, you're an idiot compared to these. So that's where we're going.
So I want to pick up on this, Ken, if I may. So you just heard better, faster, cheaper, and safer. Every time technology does things better, faster, cheaper, and safer, technology wins. Strength, dexterity, cognition, and empathy is what we bring as humans to the table. And all of those are now being actively eroded. So now, keep that thought in mind. My example, when I started my new business, the business plan called for me hiring 2 individuals to work with me because I know exactly what I'm going to do and how I'm going to do this. That was a year ago. I planned about $350,000 initial payroll for year 1 to start doing my business, right? I'm doing it. But instead of $350,000 payroll, I have a subscription to ChatGPT and another subscription to Grok and another subscription to Gemini. So let's all add it up to 60 a month. So I have effectively replaced what would be a year payroll with what is a $700 a year subscription. So the business case for replacing human labor with technology today is grotesque. It's grotesque. It is. So this is not comparable. You're not comparing ability to save half. You're saving 10,000 times, right? 10,000 time efficiency. And sadly, because we live in an environment in which we live, competitive environment, this is going to be so tempting that there is no organization out there that is going to be able to not participate in this actively, simply because its competitor will. Like, we are in a spiral that's going to end with massive unemployment. So now, again, I'm an optimist. I think we actually must go through this if we aspire to achieve a true age of abundance and prosperity, which I believe we can through full automation of everything everywhere. Then we have to go through full replacement of human labor eventually, right? So here is the message for policymakers, especially in Canada. We should be doing everything we can to remove all the barriers we have and build the economy infrastructure that is going to create sufficient wealth in Canada to keep our people afloat during this transition period. And this transition period might be 5 years long, maybe 10 years long. It is likely not going to be 20 years long. I hope not. And we are already in it. So, in my opinion, my plea to policymakers in Canada is, please understand, this is irreversible. It's coming. Please do everything you can to build the wealth locally, infrastructure. It actually starts with energy, then modern infrastructure for the AI and automation economy. We should tile Canada with AI data centers that we actually have ability to power and cool at the same time, so that we can participate in creation of this new wealth to the point where we can figure out the way to redistribute it. Otherwise, we're going to have a system-wide problem that is going to be deep and serious.
I want to double click on one of the ideas that you just said, Dalibor, which is the business case or profitability of automating human jobs. So certainly not the entire space or the entire set of human jobs will be automated immediately. But there is a segment of it where businesses and perhaps their consultants and their researchers have figured out this makes economic sense. But one of the things I've been trying to grapple with recently is reconciling the different projections of how deeply paid human labor is going to be impacted. So my previous guest, Jeffrey Hinton, he said he would expect somewhere in the next 50 years that all human occupations can be automated. And in response to that video, one of our subscribers sent us a paper by Darren Asimoglu, who last year published, he said, he predicts only about 5% of all tasks will be profitably automated. And he's looking at somewhere in the next 20-year time horizon, and that it's going to contribute 1% to global GDP. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I really think that this conversation is at the crux of the public acceptance or rejection of how fast we're actually moving in terms of an automating economy. David, I'd love to hear your take on this. Certainly not everybody is right, but how do you see the different viewpoints on how deeply into the labor market automation is going to penetrate?
Yeah, I mean, my entire view is based on history, seeing that technology has fundamentally reshaped the economy plenty of times in the past, several times over the last 500 years. In fact, we call this the fourth industrial revolution, and that is after even the first intellectual revolution of the printing press, which also reshaped politics, religion, the economy, jobs, society. So when you take a more historian view, you say, okay, well, this has happened before. It would be silly to assume that it's not going to happen again. And in point of fact, when we look at what artificial intelligence is, it is a general purpose technology. An example of another general purpose technology, the most famous general purpose technology, would be electricity. So there's three criteria for general purpose technology, and that is, one, it's pervasive, so it's everywhere and it can do everything. Number two, it spurs other innovations, other transformative innovations. So electricity created motors, allowed you to create lights, allowed you to revolutionize factories, and so on and so forth. And you could put it in cars and ships and all sorts of things. And then the final characteristic of general purpose technologies is that they continuously improve. We have seen all of those happen with artificial intelligence in the generative AI in the space of 3 years. For context, it took a century for steam engines to become pervasive. It took a century for electricity to be fully deployed. It took a century for phones to be fully deployed. And it took 50 years. Well, okay, since the internet went mainstream, it took 2 decades for the internet to be fully kind of mainstream. So what we're seeing, if we look at the cadence of things happening, the cadence is accelerating. And Dalibor can confirm this from the business side. Nobody in business has ever seen a technology get taken up this quickly. Here's an example. Last year, only 30% of Fortune 500 companies had an official use case of generative AI. This year, it's 90%. The forecasts as of last year said that it would be at 70% by 2028. So not only were the forecasts dramatically wrong, we're almost already fully saturated. And so when, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for Darren. I read his book, Why Nations Fail, agree with it 100%. But I think that one thing that we can appreciate is that Dalibor and I have a different perspective, an inside perspective of technology. We're both long-term technologists. I was an automation engineer, a cloud engineer. I was an independent AI ML researcher since 2009. So I've seen what's been coming, and I've been forecasting it and revisiting these topics for more than a decade now. That's my specialty. So I'm a newcomer to economics. I'm bridged over from the systems thinking and automation world and said, okay, what's the economic ramification? What's the social ramification? So when and the language that he used specifically, it's only going to automate 5% of tasks. One thing that the economic establishment, still kind of the orthodoxy, believes in is that you don't automate jobs away. No, you don't do that. You just automate tasks. But what is a job? A job is a role that one human can do that is a collection of tasks and responsibilities. When you automate enough of those tasks, you don't need the human anymore. So that's kind of that, and that's certainly my view as an automation engineer, because that's what I did professionally. Was I ensured that we didn't have headcount rise. I ensured that we were able to do more with less headcount. And that's why I say that from a business perspective, AI and robotics can be seen as a form of automation. It greatly expands the sphere of what can be automated. Another economist, Anton Koronek, calls this the frontier of automation. And so if you think about it, you've got a big sphere, right? So there's a Venn diagram, and one of the spheres is everything that humans can do. And over the last centuries, really since we started with machines a few millennia ago, but it picked up a lot of speed in the last couple centuries, the sphere of automation of what machines could do started expanding. And so the Venn diagram, there's a lot of overlap. There's things that machines can do that we can't. Telescopes can see way further. Radio waves can communicate via a medium that we can't even hear or see. But now the machines are doing a lot of stuff that the humans, originally only humans could do. So if those spheres continue to expand and you end up with the machine capability side of the Venn diagram completely eating the entirety of the human side of the Venn diagram, that seems more likely than it's only going to be 5% of all human capabilities and only 1% of GDP. Arguably, in the United States, AI has already contributed way more than 1 GDP. When you look at the amount of investment that's going in, it's spurring data center construction, GPU fab creation, and to Dalibor's point, the energy infrastructure to power it all, which is going to pay many, many, many dividends. So I am skeptical of, Darren's model. There is not broad consensus on specifically the long-term impact. There are different schools of thought, but that's kind of my take.
I would, if you don't mind, I just make one important statement here. The pace of change is so intense that an analysis that was done a year ago is actually too long ago. It's too long ago. A year ago, we didn't have agents, AI agents, for example. That is changing the picture for the enterprise pretty rapidly and pretty significantly, right? As I mentioned, the business case is grotesque, and just the system that we are in the system that we have, that we've built over the last 200 years of this version of employment, is not fit, is no longer fit to keep us to navigate us through this unless we have some interventions.
David, one of the things that really stands out about your work, and I really thank Dalibor for also helping me internalize this through your own framings and your own words. One of the things that really stands out is how you have a systematic way you have a systematic framework of seeing how humans contribute to productivity and the criteria through which automation as both a general purpose tool, AI as both a general purpose tool and an automation technology is displacing labor. And it's a it's a very clear way of thinking about this. And also that your framework is very much informed by history. So I really want to ask you this, some call it the fourth industrial revolution. How is it similar or different than industrial revolutions of the past? Whereas in the past, we've seen technologies have created entirely new markets, entirely new classes of occupations. What's different this time?
Yeah. So from an initial standpoint, the primary thing that's different this time is the confluence of many technologies that are each individually more transformative than most of the previous technologies, and they're all happening at once. So artificial intelligence is only one of them. Humanoid robots is another example of the rise of transformative technologies. Even if we didn't have superintelligence just a few years away, humanoid robots alone would reshape the way that we do physical work in the real world. Then you combine that with things like quantum computing, solar, nuclear fusion, genetic technology. So this is why the exponents of the fourth industrial revolution say that this is the biggest one yet. And we're only just getting started. We haven't even gotten into the lobby yet, let alone the ground floor. We're knocking on the front door of the fourth industrial revolution, which is why, over the next 5, 10, 20 years are going to be extremely interesting. Perhaps stressful, perhaps messy, but very interesting nonetheless. So then to your point about, well, technology, these revolutions have always given us new opportunities in the past. Why is that going to be any different? It's not different in the fact that it will give us new opportunities or new lifestyles. It will amplify human agency dramatically if we get the distribution problem correct. Where people get tripped up is what's called the Luddite fallacy, which is the fear that once the AI, or in this case, the original Luddite fallacy was that the looms would put all of the weavers out of work, and then the weavers would never find any work ever again, and everyone goes home and so on and so forth. A parallel to this is the lump of labor fallacy, the idea that there's a finite amount of labor to be done, you automate that, and then everyone goes home. Well, so here's a couple things. Number one, yes, human demands are infinite. The more that we have that we can produce, the more we want. And the cheaper it gets, the more we want of it. However, going back to an earlier point, there's no reason that those new goods and services must be created by human hands. If it's cheaper to do it with machines, guess what? Most people are going to buy the machine-created stuff. So that's point number one. Point number two is that historically, yes, when technology has liberated humans from the farm or liberated humans from the factory, there's that deflationary pressure, which means we have more capital and more opportunity for new goods and services. And historically, those new goods and services, whether it was, to buy a TV or, listen to music, that did create new job categories. For instance, my job as an influencer didn't exist 50 years ago, not as we know it today. So, technology, internet created an entirely new job category. But as I pointed out earlier, this new job category is a winner takes all kind. Lots of people want to be YouTubers and TikTokers and influencers, but most fail. And so even though it is a new job category, it's not that big, and it's not a scalable or sustainable one. So you combine these facts, the fact that, number one, there's no law of physics that says those new goods and services that people are demanding must necessarily create new jobs. That's just a historical pattern. So you say, okay, well, if the machine does it better, faster, cheaper, safer, don't expect it to create any new jobs. Now, lots of people have a lot of faith that saying, okay, well, but this is going to liberate a lot of people. If you're not, if you aren't working at an office job, then you have time to spend money elsewhere. But how are you getting that money in the first place if no one's going to hire you? So you have this deflationary death spiral. I call it the economic agency paradox. On the one hand, all goods and services will be much, much cheaper. Now, there are limitations to that. Dalibor and I were talking the other day.
Yeah.
Cognitive labor will be basically free. Energy is going to get a lot cheaper because the data centers are going to demand that we make energy hyperabundance through deploying a lot of solar and nuclear fusion and whatever else. But there's, you can't overrule the laws of physics, right? Time, mass, distance, and energy. Those are 4 immutable inputs. And then what you said earlier, land, those remain scarce, but technology will help us alleviate some of those scarcities and bottlenecks. But at the same time, goods and services are going to be much cheaper and jobs are going to be going down. So we can't afford to buy those new goods and services anyways, unless we get a distribution mechanism, a new way of priming the pump of this allocation of wealth. Because right now, wage labor is one of the primary allocation mechanisms that we have. That's how the free market allocates wealth across the world. And then, of course, you have capital. So if you're wealthy enough to be an investor, that's another way to allocate resources. A final mechanism is through taxing and redistribution at the government level. But we're going to lose an entire one of those distribution mechanisms because it's not going to be economically rational to hire humans. And that's where, I fully agree, universal basic income, which is a government-based transfer to kind of take money from the top and inject it at the bottom to keep the cycle going, is necessary for that future. I know I kind of got off on a tangent, but
no, that's perfect. This is a really great segue into the discussion of UBI and related ideas, because you brought up the keyword agency, economic agency. What is that? You've also talked about the Economic Agency Index. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so economic agency is a term that is not super popular. I didn't coin the term, but I kind of resurrected it. And it fundamentally means one's ability to shape their economic future or their economic destiny. And so there's a few components that go into economic agency. Stuff like property rights, job rights, those kinds of things. The democratic rights, the ability to vote, to influence the market around you, the ability to buy and sell property, buy and sell stocks, to invest and have protections for those as well. All of those figure into economic agency. And so by and large, we want economic agency to increase over time. And it's not just how much money you have, it's how you're allowed to get money and what you're allowed to do with that money once you have it. This goes back to Dalibor's point earlier that free market capitalism has so far been the best way to increase economic agency because it doesn't just create opportunities to make money, it also lowers the cost of goods and services in the long run and brings more things into the market, meaning, hey, your dollar goes further. So that's what economic agency is at a high level, and that's why I called it the economic agency paradox, because hypothetically, AI and robots and automation will give us so many more opportunities, but if we don't have any money, we can't make use of those opportunities. Now, your question about what is the economic agency index? At the very beginning of the conversation, I talked about how household income comes from 3 buckets. As a reminder, that is wage labor, capital-based income, and government transfers. So the economic agency index is based on that observation that all household income can be categorized into those 3 buckets. We know that wage labor is going to be deflating. It already has been, by the way. Wage labor as a share of income has been deflating for decades now. And that's only going to continue and likely accelerate with the way things are going. So then you say, okay, well, that's going away. So what do we want to replace it with? You don't necessarily want to rely on a government transfer. And by the way, universal basic income or a guaranteed income is a form of transfer. Necessary, but not sufficient. So you don't want to rely on that. And what you really want to try and do is create systems that direct more capital to households. And there's lots of ways you can do that. And so the economic agency index is a way of looking at those aggregates. So in America right now, just as an example, so I'm the only American on the call, but it's 60% wage income, 20% capital, and then 20% transfers. So what you want to see over time is as the wages shrink, you want to see the capital grow. And so what the index does is it tracks that. It tracks the growth of capital-based income as a component of those. And that gives us a new metric. It's not necessarily a replacement for something like GDP, but it is something else to optimize for, and it is something else to track. And you can track it at the city level, the county level, the province level, and also at the national level. And one of the things that we hope to achieve with this metric is looking at different regions and principalities to say, okay, what is this region doing differently than this region over here? So if you have a poor county, for instance, in Appalachia here in America, you say, okay, household income is 40% transfers. Why is it so high? What's going on here? And then you say, look at their neighbor who was able to turn the ship around. What did they do to fix that? Because, obviously plenty of counties, plenty of states, provinces, cities are already trying to turn the ship around, and they're already sharing information, but there's no global dashboard based on a single good metric that shows, hey, how ready are you for a post-labor economy? So that's the central most purpose of the Economic Agency Index, which is just to show how dependent are you on wages or transfers versus capital, because in our view, that free market, capital-based future is the way to go. Because again, we're heading towards hyper-capitalism. We're heading towards capital deepening and capital intensification. So that means we need households to be participating in that in the future.
This is what I mean when I say that you're adding this level of resolution that is very, very rarely seen in this conversation. And, of course, UBI as a transfer is just one design variant, right? There have been calls for universal basic capital, different forms of equity, citizens' dividends.
Yep.
And, Dalibor, I think about what you said earlier, where like so much of the wealth is going to accumulate into owners of capital. How do you see this relate with the Economic Agency Index? Is it a direct response, you think?
Yes. So the ultimate challenge is not going to be wealth generation. Wealth will be generated. The ultimate problem is the distribution of that wealth in an equitable form, which still preserves foundations of the free economy and allows Adam Smith's invisible hand to draw prices down over time, while Economic Agency Index allows individual families to navigate their degree of liberation, let's call it like that, from active labor, right? So these things are actually interconnected. And this is why I found David's work superbly important, because it actually provides deep research into where interventions for the policymakers have worked and what has been learned and what are the good examples, and proposes a model to think through that with actual concrete interventions, as well as concrete interventions at that family level, how you should think about constructing your own personalized or family economic agency index and construct it against this pyramid of prosperity that David has built. And we are in the process now. We're finalizing the playbook for enterprises. We help them think through all of this. Now, I'm not sure, Ken, if I'm answering the question. I may be rambling a little bit, so please forgive me about that. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, I want to dig a little bit deeper into this idea of you talk about wages and transfers and capital, because, in the UBI conversation, there is at once a very low resolution understanding of UBI. It's very easy to understand $2,000 a month, $1,000 a month, right? Andrew Yang's freedom dividend, $1,000 a month. That's a really, really clear and simple tagline. But of course, there are many ways, almost maybe infinite ways of funding it. So at UBI Works, we've been researching and we've been putting out a number of proposals on how to fund a guaranteed basic income and also what's called a universal dividend or social or citizens dividend. And how it's funded is really important because the money's got to come from somewhere.
This is exactly the core point of my message to policymakers. The problem is how do you capture part of the newly created wealth equitably and distribute it among the population to keep the economy going? In other words, without that, we might collapse the economy because the aggregate demand is going to collapse. So we need to keep people and the economy running. So that money has to come from somewhere. So here is the problem. At this point, in time. We might not have sufficient funding for this. More debt is the answer. We still have the ability, I believe, if we were to mobilize ourselves as a nation, declare it a national program, national project, to actually concentrate and start seriously investing in both the energy infrastructure and in reindustrialization of Canada for the modern new industry. That to me will be the right mechanism to ensure we own the means of production of that new wealth in the new economy that is already, we know it's coming. To me, that should be generating the wealth that UBI, that funds UBI. Now, on top of that, I believe we need to also start thinking about citizenships owning the land that they're on, participating as equity owners of the natural resources of where they live. That, I think, is also a very, very important component of the ultimate solution, right? So how do we make sure that all citizens in America, Canada, wherever, in the societies, gain proportionate share of the wealth of the land that they're in, right? So to me, the solution, I think universal income, I'm not sure if basic is necessary. Universal income to keep families afloat, I think is going to be required. But there are additional components, both in terms of transfers, different kinds of transfers that are possible, with other layers of the pyramid of prosperity that I think that we need to be considering. We can explain that deeper. Of course, that's another element of David's framework.
Yeah, absolutely. What's really interesting is this ownership of the means of production is part of capitalism 2.0.
I
That's
think
just so fun to think about.
I think it has to be, the challenge is going to be to preserve economic agency for humans, to preserve the economic agency of humans, and that needs to be, that needs to be captured now, while humans still have certain economic agency. So now is the time to be thinking and designing and piloting and testing. Now is the time to do that. It will be much more difficult to start discussing this 5 years from now or 3 years from now, when humans had actually lost a lot of agency that we currently have. Ultimately, right? We will ultimately, that's where this is. So this is why I think it's important to have these discussions now. Well, humans actually still have some agency. We still have ability now to, withdraw labor, if you want. Like David talks about this also in his book, right? The dynamic of power between, those who provide labor and those who own capital has shaped history throughout history, right? So we are now entering this interesting stage where this power is gradually, definitely, irreversibly leaving us as people who contribute our labor into the economy. So this is impacting all of us. We may as well come together, think through this, figure out the model that works, and get it going.
So I think this is actually a very interesting and critical direction for the UBI conversation to be taken today. Like 2025, policymakers and advocates there are still many who talk about UBI without necessarily talking about how it's funded, but this conversation is growing. So I want to dive deep into this with you, which is that UBI, there's this general idea of it, but the design space is actually really, really large. And what people think of as UBI is actually probably one piece of many layers of our economy that we can build to, I like to call it building common wealth or stewarding the wealth that's created in common, whether through natural resources or through value created by technology. So, David, I'd love to hear your take on this. How do you see the design space of UBI and other related policies?
Yeah, I mean, so fundamentally, UBI is, you can see it as a tax policy is one way to, kind of probably the simplest way to look at it, a negative income tax or a guaranteed tax return. Now, that's of course one way to look at it, but to answer your question about funding, right now I would break the buckets of funding UBI into probably 4 overarching sources. So number 1 is monetizing common goods, whether that is natural resources, land, spectrum, carbon, that sort of thing. Another opportunity is taxes, because here's the thing, not every nation has the ability to print money. Certainly cities and provinces don't have the ability to print money. So if you have a local UBI or dividend, it's going to come from tax and redistribute. Now, the alternative to that is for nations that are able to print money. You can print money and just hand it out to people, as we did during the pandemic. There are some thinkers out there that think that instead of printing money and giving it to central banks, you just print money and give it directly to the people and let the economy percolate up, or kind of split it. Because central banks already print money and distribute it that way. That would require a little bit of refactoring. And then the final is other assets that they have. So that could be like a sovereign wealth fund or a trust or those sorts of things, where you accumulate stocks, bonds, shares, other valuable assets that produce returns that can then be used to fund the government services, or even fund households, citizens directly within that government. And of course, the idea of universal basic capital is an idea where the government purchases shares of valuable resources and then just puts them in an account for a citizen. So I would say those are probably the four overarching categories. I might have missed something, but as of right now, the model isn't perfect or complete. But I would say that those are the four big categories of where does the money come from. Now, one thing to point out is that right now, one of the big fears is that UBI would be inflationary. It would drive up prices too quickly and too high. But here's the thing. Technology is deflationary, and what's even more deflationary is job loss. So if we have huge amounts of unemployment, and we have huge strides of technology, we might need something inflationary to offset the deflation. Because there's one thing that nations fear more than hyperinflation, then that is deflation. And that's just the prevailing macroeconomic and monetary theory. So if we start to see deflation take over, which of course we're not there yet, but if we get there, then it will be a very obvious no-brainer that print money and put it in the economy to keep inflation going, just as a thought experiment. So yeah, that's kind of where I would start with thinking about UBI policies. And by the way, you don't have to do just one. You can do a portfolio of these things. You can redistribute carbon taxes. You can redistribute land value taxes. You can tax companies that use robots and automation and run data centers. You can print money if that's an option, and then you can also accumulate assets at the federal level, or government level, at any level, and then redistribute it. You can do all of those, that's what we refer to as the pyramid of prosperity. Is it's not going to be a one size fits all solution. You want to have a portfolio of solutions which will reduce risk. So risk, of course, is nobody wants that much risk, particularly where the economy is concerned. But then also that creates more investment opportunities and more price signals and price discovery and more vehicles for developing the economy in the future at the federal level. Obviously, with a free market, you don't want the government to take over everything, but it can certainly be a benevolent participant.
I love how you put it as a portfolio of programs. And I'm not sure if you've created a diagram of that pyramid, but we're going to create one, and we're going to make it de facto standard of this debate. Because you've mentioned sovereign wealth funds, you've mentioned government cash transfers, UBI as a tax policy, things like carbon rebates. I think baby bonds and employee stock ownership trusts are interesting tangential and related programs. There's this entire landscape of mechanisms through which we pre-distribute or redistribute wealth around the economy to counteract the forces of a polarizing economy. Now, one thing that's, I think, really critical about this is that the taxonomy of UBI and UBI-like programs that we're talking about here is actually really important to dispel many of the straw man fallacies and critiques against UBI that exist today. So one of the top critiques that we hear are it's going to cost too much, it's going to produce hyperinflation, where's the money going to come from? It's going to massively discourage employment. But more often than not, when we hear a critique make these arguments, it's actually aimed at a straw man model of a UBI. We've heard the very prominent organizations and outspoken people attack a UBI program that costs $500 or $100 trillion. Like, they just make up a model because that's a very scary number to go up against. When in fact, some of those same critiques of UBI, some of those same critics are actually huge proponents of permanent fund dividends.
Hmm.
And so that's why I think that creating this clarity of distinguishing very, very specific types of UBI and universal capital ways to create equity and capital for citizens while also having transfers on top of that to complement that is a very important way to dispel these critiques. Now, the idea I'm trying to get at here is that there are those on the left and the right who support UBI for
Mhm.
different reasons, right? Some on the left call it a Trojan horse for neoliberalism. Some on the right say this is communism. Have you ever thought about this? Maybe there's a horseshoe theory here. Do you have any
Yeah,
thoughts?
that's
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Do you want to go first, David?
Yeah, so I mean, I tend not to engage too much with direct debates because I tend to think that ideas and programs will speak for themselves. And at least in small scale pilots, at the city level and even sometimes at the provincial level, guaranteed income programs or dividends, some kind of social dividend, they tend to work really well. The Alaska Permanent Fund is a popular example. Both Denmark and Sweden have examples of sovereign wealth funds or public trusts that have worked rather well, and either fund. I think they mostly fund the government or they fund pensions, both of which have worked rather well. One thing is that they're dependent upon, some of them are dependent upon oil, which may or may not be a permanent resource. You don't necessarily want to bank on something that's going to run out. I think it would be better to create something that is going to be sustainable in perpetuity. But yeah, these programs I think will ultimately speak for themselves. And that doesn't mean that I don't study the pushback. I just don't get into debates about it. And one thing is, a lot of people just find it morally repugnant, the idea that you get something for nothing. Many people have just a very, very transactional view of the world that if that it is a sin. For some people on a spiritual angle, it's sinful to be lazy and do nothing and get something for free, and you're a parasite if you do that. And I think that honestly is probably, from a voter's perspective, the larger issue, because many people are just vehemently opposed to the idea on principle, irrespective of what the math shows, irrespective of what the numbers show. Particularly even here in America, where I had been, this is years ago, involved in debates around, for instance, anyone can go to the emergency room and will get treated in America, regardless of if they have health insurance, regardless of their legal status, you will get treated. And that actually shows that has fewer, that costs everyone less to just get people treated than the alternative. And even though we know that something like a single payer system or guaranteed health insurance lowers costs for everyone, because then people aren't waiting until things become an emergency, many people here in America just believe that it is morally repugnant to give people stuff for free. And they say, I will vote for a policy that costs more because I am so vehemently opposed to the idea of anything free. So I think that is probably the bigger sticking point, because again, the numbers tend to speak for themselves, and hopefully in the long run that rationality will bear out. But certainly that's not a guaranteed thing right now. So that's my stance on kind of the naysayers.
I would say that Ray Kurzweil. Let me bring Ray Kurzweil up for a moment. Ken, I'm going to assume you know Ray. You know of Ray Kurzweil. He's considered to be one of the most prolific and accurate futurists. I think that his prediction rate in terms of technology wicked high, like 80%. Like 80% of his 600 predictions that he made in the last 20 years came true, right? So
The
I
only real
listened.
competitor you might have is maybe Polymarket these days,
There
but
we
he's
go.
been doing.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But he's exceptionally accurate. And I listened to him and he described what does he actually do? So what he does is painfully simple. He understands the trend and projects it forward. He extrapolates the trend. And that's the projection. So I'm bringing this to make a point. This is happening. This is irreversible. This is going to happen. And the question is just how long is it going to take for our technology to be in a position to perform every human work for a fraction of a cost. Yeah? So this is going to happen. The ultimate end state is going to be that we as humans are going to sustain ourselves through ownership of some kind. We have assets that generate some form of income and or transfers from government. That's the end state. Human labor will be performed mostly by choice. Mostly by choice. You will be, if you want to do something, you have an interest, you want to convert it into a business, or you offer something really unique where people will pay luxury premium to work with you because you are an expert. But I'm going to assume that maybe 10% of that is going to be 10% of the current workforce will be in that position eventually. So we truly need to figure out mass national scale program to keep peace, right? To keep the society at peace, first and foremost, and then ticking. And I think that both left and right should agree that peace should be priority number one, right? And to me, we are going to be eventually coming to that point where, as this unfolds, people will realize that we actually do need to provide a safety buffer. This is not about being lazy. People have built their careers, 20, 30-year careers, based on knowledge. Like we have built service, we are in service economies. 80% of our economy is service-based economy, and that is based on human knowledge and intellect and intelligence. And like people are paid because they know stuff. These people will be losing their jobs en masse in the next number of years. And as they get replaced, because automation is, as I call it, grossly more better, faster, cheaper, and safer, but grossly, those individuals will never again be able to find the job in their domain, ever. Game over. So we need to be ready for that eventuality, and we need to be thinking of that eventuality coming at us fast. It's better to be prepared and for this to not happen than to not be prepared and be caught with our pants down, right? So to me, this is superbly essential. And as we are talking about this, more and more people are waking up to what's happening. More and more people are coming to see David Shapiro's videos and having the aha moment that I did 9 months ago, right?
Yeah, me
So,
too.
right, more and more people are waking up to this. So I believe that very soon there will be a consensus amongst humans in a society, left and right, as they realize, hold on for a second, this will impact me. And small business owners realizing, oh my God, I might lose my business. What am I going to do then? Like this is very soon going to become very, very real for everybody. And I think that is the moment for us to grab, to gain that consensus. The question that I keep asking, where is the money going to come from? That is the question we need to solve. And to me, industry champions and policymakers need to be creating an economy right now that fires on every cylinder. If we do not participate in this economy now, if there are no interventions now, we do risk, I mentioned this earlier, we do risk all of the capital concentrated in the hands of very few owners of AI and automation infrastructure and platform. By the way, none of them, none of them are in Canada. Just selfish comment to make. Zero, right? Zero. So we have a job to do here in the country, and then we have a job to do as a civilization.
David, you mentioned the repugnance, this kind of pushback against getting free money or money for nothing, which I think is a kind of sentiment that actually taps into the idea that the social contract is eroding or maybe is shifting very fast. Because what's interesting is, there's this critique of basic income as deserved versus undeserved, but this conversation doesn't exist whatsoever when you're talking about permanent fund dividends.
Right.
When you go to Alaska and you ask the residents there, like this conversation, there's no concept of that this is just money you get for not working. This is a dividend by virtue of the people's shared claim on some common resource. If you go to Norway, right, there's completely the same idea, whereas over there the sovereign wealth fund is being used they have a fund that pays pensions and they use it to fund government. And there's variants of models around the world. And so I'd love to hear your take on this, which is the social fabric around labor changing. How do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, Calvinism and the Protestant work ethic has been around for, a couple centuries now, and that is a bedrock value of Western civilization. And some people even think that those values, which were originally rooted in religion, led to capitalism as we understand it today. The idea that labor is a sacred duty that everyone has, and that if you do well in the world, you'll be justly rewarded for it, and if you are a good person, you'll be rich, and if you're a bad person, you'll be poor. And this has been distilled into the idea that poverty is shameful and accepting handouts is shameful, particularly here in America. Now, when it's a dividend, because and also there's another value here, which is taxes are theft, right? Many of the people who are opposed to this are also fundamentally opposed to taxes, that just anything that is taxed is automatically characterized as criminal theft. I mean, there are people that unironically believe this, and there's people that kind of stick on that. Anyone who pays taxes is like, it stings. A quarter of my income goes to the government. I'm like, wow, that doesn't feel fair. But then I think about everything that I get in return, and it's the way that things work. So, if, however, based on the way that I think things are going, labor goes away, which means payroll tax goes away. And so then suddenly, not only are people won't have a way of making ends meet, they also won't be paying in unless they're wealthy enough to have, residual income from rental properties and that sort of thing. So then it's like, well, the social contract, and so there's kind of two ends of the spectrum. So there's the social contract, which is the process must be fair. That's from the Enlightenment forward of Western civilization, which is the process has to feel fair. And then there's the mandate of heaven model, which is the government provides, right? The state provides peace and prosperity. And between those two spectrums, people will tolerate a lot of different paradigms. People will tolerate communism or socialism or authoritarianism or fascism or republics or monarchies or whatever, mostly as long as they're safe and well fed and have an opportunity, have enough agency. As long as the state, whatever its form factor happens to be, provides enough agency, enough safety, and enough prosperity, people will generally tolerate it. When people don't have options, that's when they get angry and they affect regime change and those sorts of things. So the way that I look at it, what I would anticipate is a few things are going to happen. Obviously there's plenty of concerned citizens and policymakers and business leaders already thinking about this stuff. But the thing is, it's not painful enough yet, so that there's not enough political willpower yet to make those bigger changes. Historically, though, so this is where historical lessons come in. Historically speaking, the American government in particular tends to sit up and really act once unemployment gets above about 11%. And it dials it up even higher when it gets to 15%. And we're willing to pull out all the stops at that point. Other nations that are still struggling, even developed nations like Greece and Spain, they tolerate a higher level of unemployment for various reasons: political, economic, social. The highly industrialized nations do not tolerate unemployment that long. And so what will happen is unemployment will get to a certain level. If our theory is correct, then permanent unemployment and labor force participation rate will start declining. And it's possible that we've already hit the crescendo. We might be downhill slope from here on out. I'm watching those numbers carefully.
Yep.
So then as those numbers get worse, Congress or Parliament or whatever else are going to try more and more things to get the economy going, to get hiring. They're going to lower interest rates and hand out free money, and the economic orthodoxy is going to stick around. But as things continue to get worse, some people, and by the way, your hypothesis that some people are just going to leave work and never get a job again is already happening to some people. Some people are just permanently out of the workforce. So there's marginally attached, there's NEETs, so NEET, NEET, so not seeking education, employment, or training. On the rise, slowly but steadily on the rise. People that are kind of drifting off. That's gonna continue to increase. And so the conversation is going to keep happening. And for most people, I think that for the majority of people, maybe not the vast majority of people, but at least 50% of people, it's not going to be real until it happens to them, until they say, okay, I'm not able to find a job. And oh, by the way, the idea of just upskilling or reskilling or lateral transfers doesn't work. Historically speaking, the numbers shows that very few people make lateral transfers to an entirely new career. Doesn't happen. There's lots of reasons for it. You got your friends and your family in your current city. You've invested decades into a certain skill set. You don't necessarily want to reinvent yourself. Having done that myself, it's not easy. It's not easy. It's not a sure thing. And the last thing that you want to do when you're running out of savings is take a big risk like that. Some people, they use it as a catalyst for change, but not everyone will do that. And if there's no opportunities, it doesn't matter if they try and pivot. So over time, as this situation gets worse, if our theory is correct, if our models are correct, it'll get worse. And as economic agency goes down, political willpower goes up. And political willpower will eventually give the state a mandate to say, fix this, do something about it. Now, our nation, your nation, many nations are going to flail. They're going to make mistakes. That's a foregone conclusion just because, that's what states do. They're not perfect. But when they keep trying stuff, it's kind of like, you stop looking, you find what you're looking for in the last place that you looked because you stopped looking. They're going to try a bunch of different things until something starts to work. And then once that something starts to work, it'll probably be a combination of universal basic capital, negative income taxes, everything that we've talked about. And, in some cases they'll be like, oh, hey, let's just do job requirements. That's not going to work. Obama tried that with shovel ready jobs and nobody signed up. It's like the government is just handing out money to go do menial work, and it didn't work. It worked back in the era of the Roosevelts because there was lots of disaffected young men who just wanted something to do. Now they just want to sit online. Society has changed. Society has moved on. So shovel ready jobs, job guarantees, probably not going to work. That's something that they're going to try. And eventually they'll say, okay, we've tried everything and we're out of ideas. So who's got a new idea? And that's why we're setting the stage for these new ideas.
Yes.
And then people will realize, so here's the other thing. Here's the other side of that. Most people are ready to quit anyways. When you look at most developed nations, the majority of people are not actively engaged with work. And when you look at the people that are actively disengaged, it's in the double digits and sometimes very high double digits. In places like Japan, it's like 90% of people are burned out at work. We want to quit. We are ready for a new paradigm. And so when an employer says nobody wants to work anymore, it's like, yeah, because it's stressful and we can't make ends meet. And I mean, that's why I quit my job. I was like, you know what? I can strike out on my own and I'll work for myself because you know what? If I'm going to put in all this effort, I want to keep the rewards for myself. But not everyone can do that. In a future where all goods and services are provided by AI, good luck being an entrepreneur because the AI is smarter than you already. So unless you know something that the rest of the world doesn't, it's not going to work out. And people are going to come to terms with this fact. These new facts are just going to be, that's the thing about facts is, they don't care about your feelings. You can't argue with physics. So people will figure it out. Some people will figure it out the hard way, but through the broad distribution of human intelligence and personalities and concerns and lived experiences, there's a lot of people who are already living this reality. And that number is growing every day. And as long as it gets to a tipping point, sorry, what was that?
We are the example. We both are living in this reality, right? Actively.
We're pioneers here. So once it gets to a tipping point where people realize, obviously at the end of the day, some people are going to stick their heads in the sand, and 80 years from now, some people will be like, bring back the gold standard and bring back jobs. Someone's going to be saying it 80 years from now, but most people will accept that we will have transitioned into a post-labor paradigm into the future. But it's a gradient, right? It's not a, and there will be some tipping points. There'll be some watershed moments. Looking at complex systems, it's like you get from 8 to 12% of people is for a belief change. So if we get to about 10% of the population believes that jobs are going away forever, the belief has changed. And then once you get to about 25% of people that say, I'm never working again, then it becomes a cultural norm. It becomes a social norm. So it doesn't have to get to the majority. Only 25% of people have to say, I'm never working again. I don't want to work again. Let's vote for something else. And then you get the snowball effect and it becomes the new reality. So that's how I would anticipate it to play out as of right now. And I haven't seen any evidence to the contrary, but we'll see. Time will tell.
If it's jobs that you want, perhaps we should have spoon ready jobs for everybody. Right. And I know you're talking about like 15 to 20% unemployment or 25% of the population having a certain mentality. But if we look at youth unemployment around the world, and I'm thinking of China specifically as perhaps a dark omen, we may not be that far from that future, right? China is looking at 19 almost 20% youth unemployment, and the entire society is kind of paralyzed or struck by this 996 laying flat movement. In Canada, youth unemployment reached 15%. In US, it's 11%, and there's a real possibility that this will rise. And this is the next generation of the labor force that is not finding that ladder up in the world of work. And so I think this maybe is a great way to close our conversation here, which is to ask, like, what is the public's understanding of this, and are the cultural norms shifting? Right? It may seem like, Dalibor, David, you and I are. It may seem like we're pretty early on these ideas, but I really feel like it's seeping into the mainstream very fast. What is your sense of how the public is understanding the ideas that we've talked about today, and how fast do you think these norms will shift?
I think that there is a clear overhang of capability that extends much further than where the general population's understanding is. So there is a gap there. There is this overhang. And my concern is that when that wave falls, it might fall hard. So part of the reason why I am doing what I'm doing, is to reach out as many people and tell them that the anxiety they feel is real. There is a rational reason for it, but that there are people working really hard to figure out how do we navigate ourselves through this, not out of this, through this, into that better age of hyperabundance that we can see it, we can see it at the horizon. So we know how to get there. So to me, it is really important to keep the conversation going. It's really important to find simple ways to explain this to people, ways that people will actually understand and internalize. Then the conversation can be enriched, and richer conversation will result in better solutions. So that will be my.
David, how do you think about this? What are you seeing out there?
Yeah, so I tend to break things down into categories, and I think there's a spectrum everywhere. I talk to academics and researchers. We talk to enterprises and business leaders. I have a big audience, of course, though my audience is very much tech focused and forward focused. And everywhere I see a spectrum. And so, for instance, there's business leaders that see what's coming and they're like, yeah, this is very clearly the way forward. And there are business leaders who have no clue what's coming. Likewise for politicians, likewise for academics. What I do see out there of the people who are on board with saying, okay, you post-labor economics, very likely the way of the future. The only disagreement is how fast and how hard is it going to hit. Yeah. That's it directionally correct. And I have there's certainly skeptics out there who are very much anchored in normalcy bias, status quo thinking. This is something that I study quite a bit, which is, evolutionarily speaking, humans evolved in environments that only changed every now and then. You might have a flood or a storm that would reshape things, but then the environment goes back to being static, and the world as you know it stays the same. Even though we know historically that life has changed radically multiple times over the last few centuries, our brains have no neurology. We have no evolution, no evolved ability to intuitively integrate that into our worldview. And that is because we can know something rationally with our prefrontal cortex, but it can't override the rest of our instincts, the rest of our cognitive biases and our cognitive failures. So normalcy bias it's not It's not a moral failure or even an intellectual failure. It is a neurological truth of how human brains work, which is why I emphasize that once reality sets in, once you lose a job and you say, I've been out of work for 2 years, that becomes your new reality. Work just isn't coming back. And what you pointed out about youth unemployment, that becomes their reality permanently. When I first entered the job market and I, was getting my career started, the Great Recession hit. And so I was like, wow, I learned a difficult lesson, which is the bottom can drop out at any time. So that's just a permanent thing that I remember almost 20 years now. And, but of course, people younger than me are coming up in an even worse situation where they graduate and can't find a job or they get laid off. I was getting breakfast just a couple weeks ago, and there's this young kid, talking to, I don't know if he was interviewing for a job. It was a very casual conversation if it was an interview, but he said that he had been in tech and he had gotten laid off. And so he was looking to work at a grocery store. That's going to stick with him. And so what's going to happen over time is this generation that grows up with AI and robots and everyone constantly losing their jobs, that is their normal. That is their new normal. The idea that work is just something that you can find, because at the beginning of my career, it was like, oh yeah, I quit a job and found another job in 2 weeks. You can't do that anymore. It doesn't happen. So your sense of reality evolves with new experiences, and that's just how humans work. So that's what I am looking for out there. That's a fundamental assumption for everything that I've said about once people see unemployment sticks at 20% and stays there, they're going to realize we got to do something different. That's how I'm reading the situation.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to end the conversation and wrap it up today, because I think there's a dark path forward, and I think there's a optimistic path forward based on how we steward and build this Commonwealth capacity together. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been a conversation with David Shapiro, Dalibor Petrovic. As more segments of our economy become automated, I really think that many of these ideas will quickly go from what seemed like the fringe to the mainstream. And so we got to speak with two of the key thought leaders that are driving this frontier today. Dalibor, David, thank you for all the work that you're doing on this. And I really look forward to continuing this conversation with you next time.
Thank you so much.
All the best. Bye-bye.